Hello, everybody. Good afternoon, and welcome to our monthly CQC webinar series that we've been hosting here at the Well-Led Provider. Great to see so many of you and some faces that we haven't seen before. Welcome. For those of you that are joining for the first time, just to let you know that this will be recorded and the slides and the recording will be sent to you afterwards by email. So long as you register for the webinar, you will get that email, and that email will come from the Well-Led Provider. So no need to take copious notes and screenshots and stuff like that, although of course you can if you want, but you will get those slides and recordings sent to you afterwards. So on this webinar, we're going to take a slightly different slant than we have done so far and look at some different perspectives on CQC inspections. Perspectives from those we might be slightly familiar with in primary care, practice managers and GP partners, but also perspectives from patients and other stakeholders. So I hope you find it interesting and valuable today. We also should have time for some Q&A at the end, and generally what I do is I'm always keeping an eye on the chat and the Q&A box and trying to answer as many questions as we go along. We also keep a note of any questions that we don't get around to answering, and then sometimes we answer them in a future webinar. And this webinar will start by answering some of the questions that you put to us in advance and in last month's session. So keep asking us your questions, because it does inform the Q&A part of the webinar, but it also informs generally what content we put on for you in these monthly webinars. If we've got time, I'll run through the Well-Led Provider and some of the products and services that we offer to help you with your CQC compliance. And at the end, I will introduce you to the medicines management team, who kindly sponsor all of our webinars to make sure that they remain free to all of those who attend them. These are some of the panel that you meet today. If you've attended our webinars before, you'll be very familiar with these faces. I'm Claire Sieber. We've got Gabby Ashton on the call, who's a former CQC inspector. We've got Gary on the call, who's a former practice manager, as well as other things. Ketan might be joining us shortly, who is a GP partner and was inspected by the CQC not that long ago. We also have Karen, who's joining us today, who is a patient expert, who's going to give us a patient perspective on the CQC and why it matters from a patient's point of view. And Ali Robson, who is a former CQC inspector and now works with the GP Federation, supporting with compliance, amongst other things. And we'll get a federation sort of view on the CQC from her. And at the end, you'll meet Fahad and Rashad, who are from the medicines management team and our sponsors. So I'll hand over to Gabby now to take you through the first couple of slides.
Thanks, Claire. I don't know if it's just me, but I can't see the slides. But if everybody else can, then I will.
Yeah, I can see them okay.
Okay, fine. I will carry on with my separate notes. That's all good. So yeah, the first slide that I think everybody can see will be the data for May 2025. So we won't spend too long on this, mostly because I'm excited to hear from all the speakers that we've got today. But those who have joined us before know that we tend to just run through the last month, or in this case, the last 3 weeks worth of data from the CQC website, and the trends that we are used to discussing, we're continuing to see. So a huge amount of difference between adult social care, care home reports and GP practices that have been published, and the percentage of good remains sort of middle. The requires improvement and adequate, quite a high percentage for GP practices, actually nearly a quarter of GP practices this month have had a rating of requires improvement or inadequate, and unfortunately we haven't had any outstanding. Luckily, we're going to be hearing from a practice that have had an, so we will get some real-time feedback on what that means. So if we move on to the next slide, and as Claire mentioned, these are some of the questions that people have submitted in advance, and we'll sort of keep a live log of these. So next month we've got some more that we can go through. One of the questions was, do all staff, including reception staff, need to have Hep B immunisations? And it says that it varies with everyone you ask. So hopefully it shouldn't vary. There is pretty much just one answer for that. And the for Hep B, the guidance says that if you have direct contact with patients' blood or blood-stained body fluids, such as from sharps, or you're at risk of being injured or bitten by patients, then you need to have a Hep B vaccinations. If you Google hopefully everybody's familiar with the Mythbusters on the CQC website, and there is a specific one about immunisations in GP practices and the sort of approach that you need to take for different roles and responsibilities. So it's just thinking about having an effective programme and making sure that you also provide all staff with access to an OH assessment, and that pre-employment health assessments are completed as well. If you're not going to be doing vaccinations, then you need to have a risk assessment in place to kind of demonstrate what the reasoning behind that is. So hopefully that's a straightforward answer for everybody. Another question that we received was previously we've done really well with CQC visits and calls, but recently staff turnover has been a nightmare and we've had a whole new team and things aren't up to date. How worried should I be? So this is potentially one to unpick with the individual that's put that question in. So if you're on the call and you want to have a more detailed conversation, do let us know. But the CQC have to take a proportionate response, and I know we've spoken a lot about proportionality in the past. So without knowing too much detail about this question, I suppose my critical sort of inspector questions would be, how new do you mean by new, and are you really talking about the whole team? Because obviously that's quite a significant change and significant turnover. If, as it says, every single staff member has joined the service within, quite recently, so within a few weeks, then the CQC can't necessarily inspect the sustainability of that new workforce. So thinking about governance and processes, they won't be able to understand or know, just as you won't yet know, whether or not the things that you've got in place are working for that cohort or that new workforce, because they haven't yet had a chance to make it work and to give it a go. But they will be interested in things such as your recruitment steps, your induction and onboarding, thinking about training and access to CPD. And they'll probably also want to pick apart why you've had such a high staff turnover recently. So looking at staff culture, visions and the values. And I know we've done some webinars on that in the past, so it's worth having a look at those. And then I think thinking about your risk management. So if you have got a whole new team, what are the short, medium and long-term impacts of that shift? So thinking about risk assessments and mitigation, I'd say are areas that they'd be interested in inspecting. So it's hard to say how worried you should be, but those are areas that I would recommend that you sort of prioritise and make sure that you're confident with. And then on the next slide, a couple of other questions. So what the new style inspection looks like and how best to prepare, and also what's the most effective way to prepare for an inspection. So we've actually discussed that at previous webinars, so there's a link available for you. And we do also offer mock inspections and sort of preparedness through the well-led provider. So if that's a service that you're interested in, then get in touch. Another question we had was, why is the CQC insistent on a snapshot approach and not an ongoing evaluation? To sort of challenge that in defence of the CQC in this one, so I don't know if it's a case that they're insistent on being a particular way, but I imagine it's more a question of logistics and capacity as well. So their role is to obviously make sure that the regulations are built in, but they do place responsibility back onto the registered people, so registered manager, nominated individual, and the team around that. They're not available all of the time, and they are looking to the legally responsible person for the ongoing evaluation and assurance. It's not necessarily the CQC's role to do that. So thinking about your governance processes, and that's why in particular the registration process is hopefully quite thorough and requires a significant amount of evidence and during your interview to make sure that they feel assured about that. I think also with the ongoing evaluation, that is actually arguably what the single assessment framework has been trying to achieve. We won't go into whether or not it's worked or not in my bit of the slide, but the whole point of that was to look at individual quality statements rather than doing a comprehensive sort of snapshot inspection. So they are looking at data over time and looking at less but more frequently. So challenge that one slightly. And then the last question is, what do you expect from a single-handed GP that's different from other practices? So kind of very short answer is nothing would be different, except that it would have to be, again, proportionate. So all your quality statements that fall under the single assessment framework and the fundamental standards still apply to you regardless of the size of your service. But for example, you're not going to be having things like monthly practice meetings or doing safe recruitment checks if there is only one of you in the practice. So it's about being proportionate with the level of audits or the governance that you are giving yourself within your own framework. I would say don't set yourself up to fail, by over-promising for something that you just don't need to do. So you might want to reduce the frequency of your checks or reduce the frequency of your audits, to quarterly, for example, if you're only seeing a much smaller number of patients and there isn't a larger team to manage. Hopefully that's helpful. And we're now going to move on to the next slide, which is looking at a patient perspective, and I'll hand over to Gary for this part.
Hi, thanks, Gabby. So for this, we're joined by Karen Owen. Now, Karen I first met when she helped me get my patient group off the ground, but that Karen has done far more than that. She currently works with Berkshire Healthcare Foundation Trust. She's led a fantastic program called Health Makers, and she's been the patient rep on the clinical senate for NHS England Thames Valley. Karen, have I missed anything before we start going into the questions?
I've had a varied PPI roles since 2009. I've worked with NHS England, I've worked with the Senates, I've worked with the AHSNs, I've worked with a variety of ICSs, CCGs, was the lay member for patient and public involvement when we first met. And as you say, now I'm working managing Health Makers. But yeah, largely I came to this because I live with a rare condition, have done all my life, and therefore I am very, very passionate about getting patient voice included.
And thanks for joining us. So perfect for today. So Karen, if I can just sort of go through the questions that we see on the screen.
Yeah.
So can you just share with us what's the overall patient view on CQC ratings that practices have?
Okay. So I am conscious that as somebody in PPI, I'm always going to bring my personal perspective to these things. So I'm going to give that first, and then I'm going to give you the wider view. So personally, I was acutely aware of the ratings of my surgery when I was running the patient group, and I was aware of the enormous impact of audits on the surgery staff, and I probably had a more clinical view that aligns with all of yours right up until I stopped being on the patient group. Once I left the CCG and all of that, I changed surgeries, and I suddenly realised when you asked me to do this that I didn't actually know the CQC rating of my new practice. I knew the reputation of it when I moved over to it, but I had a choice of two, and the only reason I chose the one I did was that you led the one that I was was the alternative, and I thought that would mix relationships. So the CQC rating didn't play a part in me choosing a practice. So my view was it didn't matter terribly well. So there, I've been out and checked that because I'm aware that my views and my networks have changed a lot in the last year. So I found more or less correlation with what I was asking, with the exception of where the patients come from. So it depends if you are talking to somebody with a long-term condition. It depends if you're talking to somebody who's a carer or somebody that touches practices frequently or not much. Yeah. Or if somebody's about to move home, or if they have just experienced really bad care. That's the only time they're worried about what the CQC does largely.
Okay, and certainly that sort of probably fits with what I would have, understood from when I was in practice. So, okay, so now sort of digging into that a bit deeper then, with the second and third questions here, does it change if a practice is outstanding or at the other end of the spectrum that, special measures requires improvement? Does that change it then?
I thought when I came to this that it wouldn't change much, but actually it was fair to say that the views that I've got from the straw poll I did, and it is only a straw poll, I can't be, I didn't have enough notice to do something a bit more deep, was that actually the context of an outstanding rating is really only affecting those who are well engaged with their practice through a patient group or using it frequently as a long-term user. They like to see that it reflects what their view is of what that surgery is. They use it as a marker for that. And people in that, provided they think they're getting good care, will probably rally behind the surgery if it doesn't reflect what they think, because they put the bias on their view rather than on the CQC's. Those who have had less than good care, if they see outstanding, will use it as a social media chance to start a discussion and get their view out there, or they will perhaps, if they feel very strongly, contact CQC and tell them that's what I've been told. I can't. That's it's just word of mouth.
Yeah.
On the requires improvement matter, more people commented about that than about outstanding. So yes, more people would care. So it sort of follows up on that. They are interested that governance is taking place, and again, the view will only really matter to them if it differs from their own experience, or if they're about to move into that area and they're having to choose a surgery.
Okay. So then going on to the last question, so that feeds in nicely to this. What's your view on what patients want to know, or maybe what practices should be sharing with their patients about the CQC and their ratings? And I'm particularly wondering if in your experience you actually see things where practices are missing a trick, and there's things they should be telling them.
So I had a list of 5 things that they've come back with strongly on practice, and just 2 on the CQC. So I don't think anybody on this call will be surprised to know that the top answer was, can they get an appointment? The next was, can they park and gain access easily? Is the surgery well run and does it feel safe? And largely they use reputational information for that. They're not the CQC is not their place that they would worry about. Are the staff fully trained and supported to treat them clinically? And will they be treated with respect and empathy?
Yeah.
That's the things they're concerned about.
So are there things that you sort of think that practices miss a trick on, they should be sharing more about?
I think the practice managers have a problem. They're damned if they do and they're damned if they don't with a lot of the ways they do it. I think having a good patient group counts, because the patient group's a better voice for you than you are for yourself. People like to be told things are good by their peers rather than the service they're doing. They suspect less bias if they do that. Yeah. I think regular good information. I see quite a few people that have sort of regular newsletters and things that are coming out. If they just turf out the same stuff that they're seeing everywhere else, they're not interested. They're interested in something saying, locally we're noticing this. Here's your self-care tip, or just something of real interest. But largely, unless people are not well or are looking after young kids, they're not interested in their GP practice at all. Yeah. So the news has to be light so that they will check into it. The things about keeping you well, actually the things that you're not actually doing that other people are doing to keep people out of your surgery, promoting them. So actually seeing the surgery as a good resource for telling them which stakeholders to really get to use. It's a difficult thing, because I know you can't promote things like other private companies that are doing certain stuff, but there are certainly charities and organizations that, things like Andy's Man Club, things like locally for us, we have Friends in Need, Mind, the real support that they can actually get to manage their well-being. That would be good. And actually any education that you can give people about improving their own skills to look after themselves better. Now, you'd know I would say that, because that's my passion.
No, that's great. Karen, I'm watching the time. Thank you very much for that. I think we could take an hour talking about all of this. But thank you very much. I'm going to hand back to Gabby
Can I just tell you the two things
yeah.
on the CQC were, is it effective and proportionate governance? And are they happy that that's what's in place in the surgery? And are practices being treated fairly and equally across the country?
Right. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you. I think this is still with me, Gabby, so I'll carry on, shall I? So
Thanks, Gary. Yeah.
Yeah, we wanted to get an outstanding or a practice with an outstanding rating, a practice manager on. Sadly, we asked a couple, but nobody was free. But Michelle Freeburn is a managing partner from Bowen North Taunton Medical Practice down in Devon. It's not a single-handed practice. It's not a large practice. It's an average size practice. But she was kind enough to share her perspective. She's been on these webinars. I know Michelle quite well. And it was interesting, actually. We approached 4 or 5 practice managers that we thought were probably outstanding, and we checked the ratings before we went to them, and we were right on 4 of the 5. So you get a good sense of who you think might be as well. But we asked these 2 questions that you see. We wanted, to get a sense of how much work it was and how the practice felt about it. And it was interesting on the work side of things, how much extra work. Whilst she hasn't said exactly how much work, what comes through for me is how thorough the inspection is. She talks about the first inspection and thought they might go in the loft. And I know I'm a school governor and I've worked with Ofsted inspectors, and it's very, very similar. And if the inspection team feel that this could be going for an outstanding, then you'll expect them to be digging deeper and being more thorough. Gabby will tell us if that's right or wrong, but I think it sort of suggests that, it's, if you're an outstanding practice, you're probably going to get something sort of very intense there. And I think it also struck me in that first answer that it's what practice managers always say, how they're inconsistent, and inspections teams differ as well. How she talked about, the second one being completely different to the first, and obviously the emotions that came out from that second one as well, which are probably just doing their job, but I think personalities are important. And then in the staff view, for me, I think what comes through strongly is how this clearly must be built into their normal working practices, everything they do in their normal day-to-day operations, because it's typically for a lot of practices would say the same. We don't think there were anything special, but they've got an outstanding rating. So I think it clearly is really embedded into how they work normally as well. I think it sort of clearly comes through as well. She talks about, could be about leadership of teams. So there's a real people aspect to all of this, and particularly on things like well-led. That comes through. But then it's also what we think of CQC in terms of regulation and processes and policies and things. That's it in there as well. And I think the magic that she talks about is actually really what it means for the practice, but it also must be the smooth running for this to get outstanding, them not to think of anything, built into how they do everything. I think what it means to the staff must be a very, very smooth running practice, and there's obviously a sense of pride when they describe it as magic. So that's sort of how I interpret that. I personally, I've always sort of thought, not so sure that I would, would be worried about getting outstanding. It was something I never aimed for in practice, and I probably never could have achieved it. But you read that, and it does feel a bit more special. So, hats off to Michelle. I'm very grateful that she shared that. So, Gabby, I don't know whether you've got any comments on that.
Yeah, I've sort of made some notes. I think I'm watching the chat as well at the same time, and I think it's interesting I think somebody has said that good is more than good enough, and I thought that was quite lovely, actually. I think, yes, I think what I've enjoyed from hearing from both perspectives there is that outstanding isn't necessarily something that you are putting energy into because of the the capacity, the limits that we've all got in primary care, but actually if it's something that comes up, then that's fantastic, but it doesn't seem to be something that people are sort of striving towards, is the sense that I've got. And actually from a patient perspective, being good, that's good enough. So that feels like quite a comfortable place to be. So I suppose that's interesting, because you do get a lot of questions of how can we become outstanding, how can we strive for outstanding workshops, and actually I suppose potentially, yeah, the value in that is taking away from just enjoying and doing well at being good, and that the impact that has for both patients and the workforce. So yeah, I think it's maybe my response is underwhelming, but actually I think there's just a lot to be said for being good, to be honest.
Yeah, I would agree.
Yeah. So yeah, so thanks everybody so far. And now we get to hear from Claire. We're doing the LMC perspective.
Yeah.
So we have lots of thoughts afterwards. Yeah.
Thank you, Gabby. We have lots of GPs and practice managers on here. So this is kind of taking it to a slightly higher level, if you like. What's the sort of collective representative opinion that grassroots GPs have fed up through their LMC, their local medical committee, to the BMA? And for sort of disclosure, I sit on the BMA's GP committee and I chair the LMC conference in England, which sort of sets the policy about what it thinks should be happening, and then tries to get the BMA to negotiate that with the Department of Health and Social Care and NHS England. So this is the policy that your representatives have set already. They've said that the single word judgment, so good, inadequate, outstanding, requires improvement, which is 2 words, I suppose, are unhelpful and should be scrapped. So I think Gabby will have a response to that one. They've said that they would want the CQC, the regulator, to change its focus from making a judgment about providers' compliance to instead providing a supportive quality improvement role to a provider. The next thing that has been said is that practices, recognising how under-resourced they are, and there's been some comments about that in the chat so far, need to be given additional resources to manage their compliance and the workload associated with being inspected. So by that, what they're meaning is that the practices would like to be funded to do quality improvement work, be funded to employ appropriately trained people to be able to do quality improvement and compliance work, and to fund training to upskill their existing staff so everybody knows what this compliance deal is all about. So that's also what's been asked. Of course, these things get asked, but sometimes they're not always given to us. They've also asked that there's a minimum of 5 years between inspections if a practice has already been rated as good or outstanding, unless something serious is raised in the meantime. They've asked for a minimum of 14 days notice before any inspection, again, unless there's something serious going on that justifies doing it sooner. They've also asked for providers not to be penalised if your QOF scores aren't great, for example, because your cervical screening uptake or your childhood immunisation uptake is lower because of your patient population, and that they just don't take up these public health initiatives, because QOF does get looked at by the CQC, and it's felt that that's not fair when a practice has tried their very best. And they've also asked providers not to be penalised if there's an issue with the premises that is outside their control as a tenant and the landlord hasn't rectified that issue. So those are the asks. Gabby, what did you think when you saw all of those?
Yeah, so I have that. I can just to say, we can see the conversation about the OAH assessment. We'll get onto that if that's okay. So don't worry, we're not. I'm not ignoring that. I'm just multitasking. So and yes, the slides are. This is all recording. In terms of the LMC points that Claire has run through. So this removing the single word judgment is, I guess I don't have the answer for that, and it's a conversation that's ongoing, and particularly at the moment we've seen, for example, that Ofsted have changed their approach and introduced report cards and removed the single word ratings. I guess, yeah, my only thought to that was what would people like instead? And that's something, you know, I would be interested to hear in the conversation. I suppose you know, historically it was just whether or not you're compliant, so you're meeting the regulations or not, and looking at it purely from a compliance perspective. And then I think that lends itself to the next point about understanding the difference between quality and compliance. And I think they are different concepts and different skill sets, as we'll all probably appreciate on this call. So the CQC, as the regulator, their role is to ensure that a service maintains the fundamental standards. That is very much a compliance role. So they're not there to advise on how to achieve quality. When we think about quality, it's actually more of a continual and a moving concept that does differ from whether or not you are essentially meeting the legislation and the fundamental standards. And this might not be that helpful for people. It might cause some controversy in the chat, but that when I worked with the CQC, we did actually sometimes say that although it's called the Care Quality Commission, maybe it should be called the Care Compliance Commission, because the role that we have isn't about informing on quality. It wasn't about informing on quality improvement initiatives or quality improvement. It was very much about compliance and fundamental standards. So I know we have got a former CQC, another former CQC inspector on the call as well. So maybe there's some thoughts there. And so, yeah, when we think about quality improvement and recognizing that is different from a compliance skill set, and actually that also sits differently, for example, from somebody who's an expert in operations or in management and leadership or a clinical role. I suppose what all of these thoughts have done is remind me, and hopefully remind people on the call, about the importance of recruiting a varied workforce, and actually the importance of having somebody who is quite passionate and has that skill set in compliance and or quality as well. I think on the next point about the minimum 5 years in inspections, I guess that, I mean, you know, we used to know how things were going to, the layout of inspections in terms of the frequency and the time based on a previous rating, and we've arguably moved away from that. I suppose the question back to people is, if one of the roles of the regulator is public assurance, then is 5 years too long? Looking or researching services at a personal level potentially, or even actually if you're looking for employment opportunities, would you rely on a report that's 5 years out of date potentially? So then it lends itself to the discussion about what other quality improvements could you as a practice do to provide assurance. And we're seeing a huge amount of this now because of the lengthy waiting times between CQC visits, is that actually their own internal quality assurance report, inspections, they're doing peer-to-peer audits across different practices, and then they're making those reports and those results available for patients. So I've seen examples of newsletters that are going out to say, you know, we've done an internal quality assurance inspection, or we've had an independent inspection done because the CQC haven't been for this long, or while we wait for the CQC to visit, these are the findings, this is how we think we've done, these are the areas that we recognise. So yeah, so it's I'm not saying I agree or disagree, but it's putting that responsibility, not responsibility, but it's, I suppose it's putting the idea back to the practices to say, if we're going to wait that long, what can we do in the meantime to provide assurance for people who are accessing the services? A bit harsh with my question there. So minimum 14 days notice, and I've put why, what are the benefits of this? So that is, yeah, I mean, I'd be interested to hear more about that. But when we think about the CQC, I'll say this obviously until the day that I retire, but they're not something that you should prepare for. They're something that you should just be ready for. And that's, as we've spoken about, for hearing from, you know, the outstanding practice manager perspective, hearing, you know, the patient views from Karen, it's not some grand, well, it shouldn't be seen as some sort of big opening event that, you know, you have to get ready for. It should be welcome in, warts and all. Exactly, just some, I can see their comments, just like an infection control audit and safety. You don't prepare for that, you just show them what you've got. If you haven't got it, there's potential outcomes from a CQC point of view, and again, depending on, and we talked about this, proportionality, sustainability, etc. It doesn't have to be the end of the road. So I'm not quite sure what the benefits of a 14-day or any kind of notice period would be, other than obviously for clinicians to manage their scheduling. That would be thoughts about that. Providers being penalised if patients don't take up public health initiatives. To be honest, I agree with that. I think if there's a clear evidence trail, and we've heard again even about examples of PPGs, if there's a clear evidence trail of initiatives explored to manage uptake, and you're confident that you've considered local, you've considered them. So thinking about the need is very, very important. And I think Karen's touched on that with the, you can turf out, these are the events that are happening, this is how to keep well, this is how to stay safe, but actually, are you aware of who your local population are, how it is that they need to receive information, the type of information they're able to hear, they want to hear, and how does that align with the goals that you have, sort of internally? I think if you are confident that you've absolutely exhausted that and you have bespoke your approach to local need, then with that. And this is, so I'm actually thinking about being penalised for safety issues. The examples I gave are actually quite cringe, I think, with swimming pools and restaurants. But I suppose what I was thinking is when we look at Regulation 15, which is the premises and equipment regulation for the CQC, is saying that providers, you do retain legal responsibility. And so when you delegate responsibility through contracts or agreements to a third party, you still need to make sure that you, from an assurance point of view, that you're meeting the regulation through the work that they're doing. And ultimately, the CQC do say that any shortfalls rest with the provider. So when a stakeholder is accessing a service, they do expect that service to have elements or oversight of all of those different elements. So examples I gave, I couldn't really think of any, but hopefully you know what I mean. Swimming or access like a public, or you might eat in a restaurant and you see that something's clean, unclean, or broken. I've never known myself, for example, go to reception and say, I'd like to speak to your cleaning contractor, or I'd like to speak to the maintenance department that you outsource to fix things. You are looking directly to the provider that you are accessing services through. So yes, again, we talk about the CQC being proportionate. So if you've identified a risk, you've done everything you can to mitigate that risk, you've notified the right people, you've put steps in place, you've got an action plan, or you've got sort of a plan of action, and or the third party just are not supporting you, and you've got plans to change or look at that, then they should be proportionate. But I don't think the CQC are going to change their stance on that regulation, essentially, and the view that it is that, when we think about the legal requirements of the registered person and the expectations of people accessing services, would be my challenges. So I can see that the chat is going off. So I'll hand over to for the federation perspective, and I will have a look at the conversations that are going on. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Gabby. We wanted to just bring in some views of the organisations that general practice is working with, so in GP federations and PCNs as well, because I suspect going into the future that these are going to be more and more important. So Ali Robson is on the call, and I can't see her, but Ali,
I'm here.
if you're there, yeah, I just can't see your camera. That's fine. Just to introduce Ali. Ali was my CQC inspector when I was back in practice. So we've got two great ex-inspectors on the call, and I've got the pleasure now to work with Ali in her role as quality and compliance manager at Berkshire Primary Care, who are a large successful GP federation down in Bracknell, Berkshire. So Ali, thanks for joining us. Did I miss anything on the introduction?
Oh, just that I'm a qualified singer, and I can do calligraphy. What else do you want to know?
Yeah, I know there's lots of strings to your bow. Well, look, I'm going to be mindful of the time, so I'm going to dive into these. So, how relevant is the CQC to a GP federation?
Just as relevant as to any healthcare provider. We provide regulated activity. and therefore we need to make sure we're meeting the fundamental standards. I think Gabby is a bit of a kindred spirit of mine because she was answering everything. I was obviously not on screen, but I was sitting there nodding away to a lot of what she was responding to, a lot of those questions, especially from the LMC. You know, the CQC is not the enemy. The CQC are just there to enforce the law, the Health and Safety, the Health and Social Care Act, which is in law. So any CQC inspection or assessment is vital to make sure that you're meeting those standards. It's a check. It's just like you'd ask any airplane pilot to show that he's qualified to fly that plane before you step on it. You want to know that those reassurances have been done by the company that you're paying the money to. Why should it be any different in healthcare?
Yeah.
So it's the federation, like I say, our federation, models might be different, but we provide regulated activity. So we are beholden to the regulations as much as any other healthcare provider.
Yeah. And I suppose it's easy for if you're in a GP federation or a PCN that are not regulated, you haven't got to have your own inspection. It's easy to think, well, you know, it doesn't matter what we do, it doesn't matter what practice do. But actually, how much does the CQC rating of the practice impact on a federation?
It doesn't have a direct impact on the federation per se, but obviously no one wants to see anyone that's either struggling or failing in some way. And alternatively, we want to know that our federation members are striving and you know, fulfilling everything they should in terms of the regulations. So if there were, I can go on to the next question as well as part of this, I think,
carry on.
because obviously part of my role within our federation is to support practices with their CQC compliance. So I have this little motto that I'd rather prevent fires than fight them. So I'd rather, if I know that there's a practice that has got a rating that requires some form of quality improvement of the standard, then I would want to make sure that I'm giving the benefit of my expertise and knowledge, both from a healthcare perspective, I'm a nurse by background, as well as my CQC regulatory knowledge, so that they can actually be supported to make those improvements. Or on the flip side, if they're thinking of introducing something or not sure how to go ahead with something, I'd rather they asked me or even ask their CQC inspector, not they have designated inspectors currently, for that advice. In fact, one of the things when I inspected Berkshire Primary Care, who I also inspected and now I'm working for them, was that I had a really good relationship with the operational director, and they would actually ask me before they initiated things to make sure that they were in line with the regulation. So having that supportive two-way conversation and that process where it's all about sharing and learning is absolutely vital.
Yeah, I mean, not every federation is going to be lucky enough to have an Ali Robson.
No.
But, you know, if I were back in practice, CQC is so tough for practices. I'd be wanting all the support I can get. And I think sometimes federations particularly can be sort of underutilised. If you were in practice, what can we ask a federation for support with? You know, where can they really help us? What sorts of things in terms, you know, can they do for CQC?
So again, it depends on the model, the federation model. So I can only speak from my experience with BPC. We have over 70 staff. We provide a lot of the ARRS funded personnel. We do a lot of background workflow type work. We've got care coordinators, we've got social prescribers. So there's a lot of support we can actually offer the GP surgeries that takes a lot of the onus off of them, which means that they can obviously concentrate on their main focus, which is their patients. If you're focusing on your patients and you're focusing on patient safety, you shouldn't, like Gabby said, you shouldn't be worrying about CQC coming to visit because you're meeting all those fundamental basics to start with. So it's a win-win if you have got a federation that you can tap into with their resources. If the federation isn't as forward thinking, maybe you need to ask and just say, is there anything you can actually do to help us? So we've got a virtual hub as well that answers GP phone calls and take clinic and e-consult referrals. and actually organise the appointments. You know, we've got an extended access service, so we're providing specific GPs, HCAs, phlebotomists and nurses to look after patients locally in the evenings and at weekends, offering those additional appointments. So there's a lot actually that a federation could do if you've got that right model, or even across the PCN that you could do if you've got the right model to help support the individual practice and take a lot of some of the pressure away from the individual practice.
Yeah, if I put my practice manager hat back on, and I think for all the practice managers on this call, I think you get real support and benefits from talking to your other practice managers. But I'd be also speaking to the PCNs and the federations and say, come on, let's work together, let's get some support, because practices need it, and PCNs and federations, I think, are expertly positioned or ideally positioned rather to be able to sort of coordinate things and help. So okay,
absolutely.
The last question then, from your own position at Berkshire Primary Care GP Federation, what's the biggest challenge that you've had and how have you overcome it?
So the biggest challenge, I think, is that we have grown and developed rapidly just in the last 3 or so years. So even from when I inspected back in 2018, it was a much smaller organisation. And because of that, obviously, things have expanded and grown, not necessarily with the focus on the regulatory aspect, but certainly a focus on patient care and patient safety. So I think the biggest challenge I've faced since I've been here in the last 2 years is actually making sure that all the policies and processes are absolutely in place, that they're fully embedded, that people know what they are and what they're expected to do. Supporting the staff, I think, is one of the biggest as well, just making sure that our staff are happy and looked after and that their well-being is provided for, because happy staff results in happy patient care. The GP, as a federation, we're really lucky. So one of the differences I was going to mention between a federation and a GP service, we're an at-scale service, and there are GP services, and there may be some of you on the call today that are an at-scale GP. Great, you probably have similar to the federation model. We actually have people in the finance department. We actually have an HR department. You've actually got a quality and compliance department, which is me. So not all GPs have that, because that all comes down to the practice manager and it's all on their head. They've got to do payroll 1 minute, they've got to do recruitment the next, they've got to do staff disciplinaries and dealing with sickness on another day. Then they've got to deal with all the issues that are being raised to them. They've got to deal with meetings, they've got to deal with the PCN. There's so many hats that you have to wear if you're an individual who's responsible for a provider. With the federation, that is a lot easier, although with the federation there comes challenges, and you've got so many people trying to keep on top of everyone's training, making sure the recruitment process are properly embedded and followed through. If you want to expand and sort of take on 5 people, you've got a lot of processes there to be working through and making sure that they're properly embedded. So it has its challenges, but it also has its major benefits.
That's great. Ali, thank you very much. Conscious of the time, so I'm going to hand back to Gabby. Thanks for joining us today and sharing that. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Ali, and thanks, Gary, for sort of teasing that out of Ali. Really interesting. For the sake of time, I'm not going to give you too much about the other contribution I was going to make, which is my kind of clinical hat where I locum, other than to say I did a little test. I picked 13 surgeries that I'd worked in most recently and tried to guess their CQC rating, just based on my experience of locuming in the surgery. And the ones that were inadequate or requires improvement, sadly, there were some in that 13. I'd correctly guessed that they were inadequate or requires improvement, just based on my interactions with them as a locum. And the ones that I thought were good were all good. So it's just an interesting observation that you can get a good idea of a CQC rating just by going in and doing one clinical session and interacting with the surgery in the way that a locum does. Gabby, I'm going to skip to your key takeaway slide if you want to sum up.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. And people, I'm working on the OH once, don't worry. I'm typing away behind the scenes. So, so key takeaways, that's sort of taken away from hearing from everybody today is it's clearly more difficult to recruit for requires improvement or inadequate services. That's something that I think actually that was probably going to be discussed a little bit more with the locum conversations, but it's important to bear in mind we are all hearing about the recruitment difficulties and dilemmas that we're facing. So if anything, even if we're not thinking about the organisational benefit or the patient perception of a rating, if we are thinking about staff retention, staff wellbeing and onboarding, then there is at least that benefit to having a good rating. As Claire has briefly mentioned, it's fairly obvious to Claire, and therefore it will be to many other stakeholders, what your actual CQC rating is. And so, which kind of leads us to the next question is, if I think don't overthink the role of the CQC. So they aren't going to be, by the sounds of it, what we want, what we believe that they should be, or what we think that we need in terms of quality improvement work, in terms of quality assurance, ongoing relationship building. I think we have to just accept the fact that that's not A, what the CQC are, and nor B, who they will ever be. But it doesn't mean that you can't fill that gap. So it's thinking outside the box a little bit, as we've touched on earlier with quality insurance and quality improvement initiatives. And so thinking about how you perform yourself. So are you going to be looking at internal quality audits, or bringing patients in to support with, we've spoken about this in other webinars, and some of the practices that I've worked with have done things where they've had patients do walkarounds, meet with teams, meet with staff, and actually themselves provide insight into the quality of a service. So there are ways that you can fill the QI gap without relying on the CQC. And then really, as we've heard, the benefit of a good team is actually, and good partners, really highlights to us again the value in the well-led key question. So although it's the last of the 5 key questions, and therefore often one that people come to last when they're looking at sort of QAing themselves or doing their own audits, I think if you put it to the top and focus on that one, you probably will find that the other 4 key questions will follow. And then I've just added in there myself about the point we focused on earlier, which is good being good enough, and actually do not turf out information just for the sake of it. So when we're thinking about providing information to staff, to stakeholders, members of the public, don't make it generic, and don't do something just because you think that's what you should be doing. Actually make it meaningful, and that will save you time, but also hopefully improve outcomes as well.
Thank you, Gabby. I'll let you get back to trying to answer that question in the chat, which I know you're working hard on. Gary, can you just check, are you seeing the slide now with the webinar QR codes on? Yeah. So we've got a couple of thank you. We've got a couple of webinars coming up next month, and if you get our emails, you'll get the invites to them anyway, but if you want to be keen and register for them now, you can. We're starting to launch some wellbeing workshops for workforce, for practices or groups of practices, or PCNs or federations to sign up to, and we've got a free taster webinar about that, hosted by the wellbeing expert who will host the workshops on Tuesday the 10th of June at 1 p.m. So do look out for that one if you're interested. That's free. And then our final CQC series before the summer is on Wednesday the 25th of June, and that's again on workforce as well, but workforce wellbeing as well, but this one will be hosted by Gabby and the usual motley crew that you're seeing here now. And we're going to look at the wellbeing part of CQC and reflect on the fact that it's moved quality statements. It was in the well-led quality statements, it's now in the caring quality statement, and what that means, why that's happened, and what that might mean for you in terms of hitting good when it comes to the caring quality statement, which is one that often gets a bit less attention, I think, than some of the other ones. So do tune in for that free webinar with us, our usual team, on Wednesday the 25th of June. And I will now hand over to Rashad, who I think is on the call from the medicines management team, who, as a reminder, kindly sponsored this whole series and make sure it remains free to you all with all of the resources that you can dip into afterwards. Are you there, Rashad?
Hi, everybody. Thank you for that very informative and insightful presentation.